Besieged the MacArthurs with invitations. The general refused them all. Jean did her best to be gracious. Arthur turned 5 that first winter in Australia. He seldom saw his father during the day. He did see his father in the morning.
And they would march around the living room, swinging their arms, stamping their feet, boom, boom. And MacArthur would hide presents under the cushion. The boy would then start looking under the cushions for presents and so on. And he had breakfast with his parents, then MacArthur would leave. That would be it until the next morning. MacArthur only really saw his son at breakfast.
MacArthur wrote a prayer for Arthur. Build me a son, O Lord, who will be strong enough to know when he is weak, and brave enough to face himself when he is afraid. One who will be proud and unbending in honest defeat, and humble and gentle in victory. 20 years later, he would use almost the same language at West Point to describe the attributes of a soldier. MacArthur's air commander, George Kenny, had masterminded the troop movements to Bunna. In February 1943, he began to move up the New Guinea coast. The Navy would not risk aircraft carriers in the shoals off New Guinea. MacArthur had to rely on his Army Air Force.
Initially, MacArthur does not think much of air power because of the bad experience he'd had in the Philippines, where his Air Force was wiped out within 24 hours of the war beginning. But Kenny really converts MacArthur into an air power enthusiast. Kenny's so successful, he's so confident, he knows how to use his air forces so well that MacArthur becomes enamored with air power.
At age 63, he was learning a new way to fight a war. His Air Force destroyed Japanese convoys carrying reinforcements to New Guinea. Without them, the Japanese offensive in New Guinea was doomed. By March 1943, the Japanese were on the defensive. They dug in, waiting for MacArthur to attack. Instead, as he was fond of saying, he would hit them where they ain't. Fly over them, bypass their strongholds. MacArthur went along on one early mission. They're my kids too, he told Kenny. He was less worried about getting shot and getting sick. I'd hate to get sick and disgrace myself in front of the kids. In MacArthur's first airborne assault, his kids captured a Japanese airfield. That set the pattern for his New Guinea offensive, securing one airfield after another.
MacArthur's offensive across New Guinea is a march of the airfields. Remember, Nimitz and King will not let MacArthur have any aircraft carriers, so he has to find his own close air support. The only way to do that is to move inland from the beach, seize an airfield, or build an airfield, and then use that position to destroy enemy air power down the coast some more and repeat the same operation. And that's what New Guinea offensive is.
He was driving slowly toward the Philippines. What he learned that summer of 1943 would drive him harder. From soldiers smuggled out by submarine, he learned what happened to the army he left behind. How they were marched more than 60 miles to prisoner of war camps. He learned of the Bataan Death March.
As I was marched down that road where they captured me, I passed my battalion commander, Major James Ivey, and he'd been tied to a tree and he was stripped to the waist and he was just covered with bayonet holes.
Oh, they bayoneted people, they shoot people, and if they think that you were delaying the march, you're dead.
You'd hear a shot fired and you look back and there lays a body behind you, but they wouldn't let you go back and take care of them.
If you tried to get food, which was thrown by the civilians, that not only endangered you, but the one who was giving the food or throwing the food to you.
They provided food one time in those 9 days. It was in a horrible place that was just jammed with humanity. The disease and the smell of the place was sickening. You couldn't get out, you couldn't lie down, there was no room. And men went mad in that place overnight.
Some made their way out of Bataan to join the resistance as guerrillas and to wait for MacArthur's return.
I leave and I shall return. We all, those of us who admired him, always believed he would return.
I never lost hope. If I had, I'd have probably surrendered like all the rest of them did. I always thought enough of America that someday our army would be back there to get us.
MacArthur said he would return. The Joint Chiefs never did. In the fall of 1943, they began to favor Admiral King's Navy, which had launched new fast carriers.
The Navy was surprised, but delighted. MacArthur was surprised and appalled, because it looked for a while, and by the end of 1943, that the Navy was going to get to Japan before MacArthur could get to the Philippines.
MacArthur worried that he might be forced to end the war as the conqueror of New Guinea, not the liberator of Luzon. When he got a new B-17 that fall, he told the pilot who picked it up, "I want the plane named Bataan, and the artist is to paint a map of the Philippines on the side. That's an order." He made certain that everyone knew where he was headed. The Navy's drive to Japan began in November 1943 with a marine assault on a tiny island named Tarawa. Landing craft stuck at low tide were sitting ducks for Japanese gunners. Thousand Marines were killed, 2,000 injured to take an atoll less than 3 square miles. At this time, the war plan was being set for 1944. To MacArthur's horror, it continued to favor the people who planned Tarawa. In December 1943, the big powers agreed on a second front in Europe. Eisenhower would lead it. The British opposed America's Pacific offensive as diverting shipping away from Eisenhower. George Marshall fought the British to preserve the Pacific War, but had to tell MacArthur that the Navy was still going to lead it.
MacArthur received this with a lack of grace that's really stunning. On the other hand, he was heartbroken. He had, after all, been shorted his shipping to a degree that's virtually unmanageable. He had conducted an offensive on a shoestring. He had done marvelous work with limited air and with only a handful of divisions. And now he was being told, in effect, that despite a series of stunning victories, he was going to have a competitor in the north for shipping, and shipping was a big problem in the Pacific.
MacArthur claimed the chiefs had shortchanged him because of Admiral King's animosity toward him.
My guess is that Marshall didn't phrase it in those terms, but that MacArthur interpreted it in those terms. MacArthur personalized issues. And my belief is that Marshall said, you've got to understand that the Navy is also out here, and MacArthur said, aha, they're trying to stop me.
Admiral Nimitz assaulted the Japanese in the Marshall Islands 2 months ahead of schedule. MacArthur was shocked. To keep up with the Navy, he had to do something dramatic. He decided to seize the largest island in a chain called the Admiralties. It would protect his right flank for the march across New Guinea toward the Philippines.
If he doesn't take the Admiralties as quickly as possible, if he adheres to the original strategic timetable, it might be too late to influence the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So even if he would take the Admiralties behind schedule, it wouldn't matter. He would be frozen out of the Pacific War. So MacArthur thinks it's well worth the risk.
He would attack quickly with a mere 1,000 men, discarding the plan for an assault a month later with many thousands more. The place is lousy with Japs, a scouting party reported. MacArthur did not back down. He was restless, too excited to sleep, his doctor recalled. It was almost as if battle fed his system. As the assault began, he learned the Navy wanted the island's harbor to support its Central Pacific drive. He wired Marshall requesting an audience with the president.
There is an implied threat that he doesn't get his way. He will have a showdown with the president. He will remain in the United States. He will be out of the war. He does not want to be squeezed out and watch the Navy in the last year of the war, fighting all of the battles and getting all of the glory.
If he went ashore, MacArthur reasoned, how could the Joint Chiefs order him to give the Navy what he had risked his life to seize? Refusing a helmet, he sported his Philippine Field Marshal's cap. Sir, we killed a Jap sniper in there just a few minutes ago, an officer warned him. Fine, MacArthur replied. That's the best thing to do with them. To keep up with the Navy, MacArthur had gambled and won. He saw opportunities, an Army historian noted, where other men saw problems. Even crusty Admiral King, who compromised on the harbor, admitted the invasion was a brilliant maneuver. Two weeks later, in March 1944, the Joint Chiefs authorized MacArthur to advance to Mindanao in the southern Philippines. He seized this as his chance for redemption, his chance to rescue the men he had left behind.
The situation at that time was the Japanese were already too cruel, and we needed help right here in our country. And that's why it made a lot of difference for MacArthur to think of coming back to the Philippines and liberate the Philippines before going to Japan.
But the chiefs had only guaranteed MacArthur a return to the southern Philippines. Only a token return. The possibility of a triumphal return as the liberator of Luzon, where his men were, was remote. His chance to be a man of destiny was fading.
Years ago, I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
MacArthur's vow at a state dinner in Australia came 5 days after he had received word he would probably not return. It was his message to the Joint Chiefs that the debate was far from over.
Track MacArthur's march across the Pacific. Hear stories from the men who survived Bataan. Download the General Screensaver. The American Experience Online, www.pbs.org. Tomorrow night, in the theater of war, he was producer, director, and star. But brilliant military victories were shadowed by crushing personal defeats. The conclusion of MacArthur, tomorrow night on The American Experience. To order the 2-tape set of MacArthur, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS. A production of WGBH, Boston. Major funding for The American Experience is provided by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you, and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
And by Miracle Grow Plant Foods. For flowers, for vegetables, for a beautiful show, for lawns and for shrubs. Whatever you grow, a gardener's true friend is Miracle Grow.
Each American experience is made possible by Liberty. Liberty Mutual Insurance.
This is History's Best on PBS.
Space, cold, forbidding, a domain where only the bold dare venture. Not anymore. From asteroid mines to weightless vacations, interstellar entrepreneurs are staking a claim on the high frontier. Voyage to the Milky Way, because everyone can use a little more space. Launches May 19th, only on PBS.
Broadcast of the American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Sovereignet, with offices in Bellows Falls and Burlington, providing locally owned and operated statewide internet access and made-to-order high-speed business solutions to Vermont and New Hampshire. By the 55 attorneys at Downs, Racklin, and Martin, providing sophisticated legal services to businesses and institutions throughout the North Country, from offices in Burlington, St. Johnsbury, and Brattleboro, Vermont, and Littleton, New Hampshire. By Schumacher Design of Montreal, Quebec, creators of the new Vermont Public Television logo, offering logos, brochures, posters, and much more. Schumacher Design, image makers for business and the arts. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you. You're watching Vermont Public Television, Vermont's statewide public television network.
Imagine yourself pole vaulting at the age of 86.
I think there's no question that we will be able to slow the aging process. We really understand the fundamental processes that cause aging.
Imagine yourself graduating from Harvard at the age of 89.
There are some people who think that we can turn the clock back by reversing the stopping of cell division.
Imagine yourself conducting a symphony orchestra at 90.
What we're talking about is doubling lifespan, potentially tripling lifespan.
Discover how our lives can be longer and healthier than we ever dreamed.
There's no way to stick this genie back in the bottle.
Stealing Time, the new science of aging.
Coming Wednesday, June 2nd at 8 on Vermont Public Television. This is Byron Ayanaglu, a man who lives to eat.
Delicious.
He's a well-known food critic, author, and a former restaurant owner himself.
I'm going to go and eat this, and we'll be right back.
And now he's host of the Restaurant Roadshow. Come with Byron to the kitchens of the area's finest restaurants. The chef's cooking secrets will be revealed.
Now, you don't need to cook your seafood all the way through. Right, of course not.
When can you see the Restaurant Roadshow? Watch for it in June, right here on Vermont Public Television.
By the 55 attorneys at Downs, Racklin, and Martin, providing sophisticated legal services to businesses and institutions throughout the North Country, from offices in Burlington, St. Johnsbury, and Brattleboro, Vermont, and Littleton, New Hampshire. By Schumacher Design of Montreal, Quebec, creators of the new Vermont Public Television logo, offering logos, brochures, posters, and much more. Schumacher Design, image makers for business and the arts. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you.
Presenting history's best on PBS.
In the theater of war, he was producer, director, and star. But brilliant military victories were shadowed by crushing personal defeats. The conclusion of MacArthur, tonight on The American Experience. Major funding for The American Experience is provided by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you, and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
And by Miracle Grow Plant Foods. For flowers, for vegetables, for a beautiful show, for lawns and for shrubs. Whatever you grow, a gardener's true friend is Miracle Grow.
Each American experience is made possible by Liberty. Liberty Mutual Insurance.
Hello, I'm David McCullough. Welcome to the American Experience. We present now the second and concluding part of MacArthur. On Thursday, April 19th, 1951, in the midst of the Korean War, a 71-year-old five-star American general, drawing to the conclusion of a powerful address to Congress, quoted lines from an old barracks ballad. "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty." And then he said goodbye. It was a moment like no other, the famous curtain line for one of the longest, most dramatic military careers in our history. Fired for insubordination by President Harry Truman, General Douglas MacArthur had flown home from Japan to a triumphant hero's welcome. Some likened it to the return of Caesar. As we saw in Part 1, MacArthur was not a man to evoke indifference. He was idolized and ardently disliked. He was thought an awful ham and the most admirable American of the age. Interestingly, he knew little of American life. When he flew home that spring of 1951 to address Congress, he hadn't set foot in the United States for 14 years. In half a century in the service of his country, MacArthur had seen more of war than any American. And watching this film, one is reminded again of how many wars there were and the horror and terrible cost of them. To anyone interested in the complexities of human nature, MacArthur is infinitely fascinating and a vivid example of how often events turn on the personality of a leader.
For nearly 2 years, he had struggled through the jungles of New Guinea, fighting the Japanese and the war planners in Washington. Across oceans, in a bitter competition with the Navy, which he felt was out to thwart him. In April 1944, General Douglas MacArthur was about to launch his biggest battle since World War II began. He was destined, his parents had told him, to be a great man. At West Point, he had been first in his class. In World War I, America's most decorated soldier. But in 1942, he had presided over the biggest defeat in the history of the U.S. Army. The surrender of more than 70,000 American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula guarding Manila Bay and the island fortress of Corregidor. MacArthur's redemption lay in how quickly he could move across New Guinea and rescue the men he had left behind. His troops sped toward Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea in April 1944. MacArthur was still 1,500 miles from his men, and they were suffering.
When somebody was accused of being a collaborator with the Americans, they would be given all kinds of torture in order to get from them any information that they might have with regard to the guerrilla forces.
I thought it was a Filipino, was an American Indian. They beheaded the individual. They put his head on a pole. They walked up and down the main road in the camp so we could all see what happened to an escaped prisoner.
And early in the morning, they were brought to the Chinese cemetery in Manila. And they were beheaded right there. They were just told to kneel down in front of the holes where they're supposed to be buried, and with the Japanese samurai.
I leave, but I shall return. We all, those of us who admired him, always believed he would return.
I shall return. And we were always banking on his return. That's why we continued fighting.
MacArthur had told Philippine President Manuel Quezon, when he retreated to the States, that he would lead him back to Manila with his bayonets. Manila was MacArthur's spiritual home. He had lived there with his family for more than 6 years before the war, serving as Quezon's military advisor. His son, Arthur, spent his first 4 years in Manila. After they retreated to Australia, Arthur, age 5, asked his father, "When are we going back to Manila?" This was the question MacArthur asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. He wanted to liberate Manila en route to Japan, but the decision was theirs, not his. In the spring of 1944, only Army Chief of Staff George Marshall supported him. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King wanted a more direct route toward Japan. The Navy's new fleet of fast carriers was designed to sweep rapidly across the Pacific. MacArthur had counted on the support of the Army Air Force. Their new bomber, the B-29, came online in 1944, and they were eager to use it against Japan. The Navy, not MacArthur, could get them within bombing range. In March of 1944, the Air Force sided with the Navy. The chiefs ordered the Navy and Marines to take the Marianas Islands. From there, B-29s could reach Tokyo. The chiefs then favored a Navy push toward Formosa. Formosa would be a staging area for the invasion of Japan. MacArthur was appalled to learn that his New Guinea campaign would terminate in the southern Philippines, far from Luzon, where his men were suffering as prisoners of war. MacArthur could only count on a token return, not a heroic return as the liberator of Luzon.
The strategic decisions that are being made in the middle of 1944 are essentially going against MacArthur. It's frightening. It looks like his nightmare is going to be realized and not his dream.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, however, leaves a loophole for MacArthur. They say that it might be necessary for MacArthur to seize parts of Luzon, which is really the heart of the Philippines. MacArthur will use this little loophole to press for a Philippines campaign. MacArthur decides if he can get across New Guinea faster than the Navy can get across the Central Pacific, then he can reopen the debate somewhere down the line and persuade the Joint Chiefs of Staff to let him occupy all the Philippines, not just the southern Philippines.
MacArthur believed Eisenhower and Marshall were against him in Europe, the Navy was against him in the Pacific, Roosevelt was a tool of the Navy and of Marshall. All of this led MacArthur to believe that only a political club would give him the power or leverage he needed to get the supplies, the attention, and the strategic priorities which he thought were rightfully his.
MacArthur, we want you for president.
Congressman Albert Miller of Nebraska supported a MacArthur run for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1944. Unless this New Deal can be stopped, Miller wrote MacArthur, our American way of life is forever doomed. I do unreservedly agree with the wisdom of your comments, MacArthur wrote back. When the correspondence became public in April, MacArthur appeared to many as disloyal to his commander-in-chief. To one observer, he was a rather pompous and ignorant ass. He was forced to deny his candidacy. MacArthur received another blow in June. The Joint Chiefs visited Normandy after General Eisenhower's successful D-Day landing. They wanted to speed up the Pacific War. George Marshall alone had stymied King's demand for bypassing the Philippines. Now he began to agree with Admiral King.
And Marshall begins to think about bypassing the Philippines and Formosa and going straight for the Japanese home islands. When his planners make clear that that cannot work, he will say Formosa is strategically a better option than the Philippines.
If the Philippines were to be bypassed, MacArthur cabled Marshall, he wanted to meet with the president. Marshall cabled back, you are allowing personal feelings to override our great objective, which is the early conclusion of the war with Japan. You confuse bypassing with abandonment. He then ordered MacArthur to report to Honolulu on July 26th. The day after Democrats nominated Roosevelt for a fourth term that July, the president secretly boarded a cruiser and headed for Honolulu.
General MacArthur arrived at the dock where the cruiser Baltimore was tied up in an open car, which everybody knew belonged to the madam of the biggest whorehouse in Honolulu.
And then he very casually but smartly started walking aboard ship up the president's gangway, up this red-carpeted gangway, which no one else had used up to that point.
General MacArthur went up the gangway, stopped halfway, turned and waved to the crowd.
As though he had all the time in the world and no one was waiting for him. And then when the cheer died down, he continued on up the gangplank and boarded the ship.
I guess you know what this conference is for, FDR said, annoyed MacArthur had kept him waiting for an hour. No, MacArthur replied, I am completely unprepared.
I mean, what a lot of nonsense. MacArthur wasn't prepared. He knew exactly what this was about. And he was all loaded for bear.
For 3 days, MacArthur and Roosevelt played politics. FDR's agenda came first. He toured military installations with Admiral of the Pacific Fleet, Chester Nimitz, and America's favorite general, a prominent Republican.
There's nobody in the Navy who shares MacArthur's prestige. I mean, yes, Nimitz is important, and Admiral King is important, and Admiral Halsey is important, but no one has the prestige and standing that Douglas MacArthur does. And Roosevelt identifies himself with MacArthur. Again, he's taming him. He's using him. He's going to disarm conservative mood and attitude and feeling in the United States.
MacArthur's turn came after supper, when they discussed the next step in the war against Japan. Admiral Nimitz made the case for attacking Formosa. MacArthur stressed America's moral obligation to liberate the Philippines.
Well, MacArthur, the admiral said, he kept repeating, I have promised the people of the Philippines that I will return. I have to keep my word. I cannot break the word. He said the United States would hate me if I didn't keep my word.
The next day after lunch, he managed to get 10 minutes alone with Roosevelt, and he made his strongest case, which was essentially a political pitch. He said, Mr. President, you hope to be re-elected president, but the country would never forgive you if you left 17 million Christian American subjects to wither under the conqueror's heel until there is a peace treaty. Politically, it would ruin you.
He was leaving no question in Roosevelt's mind that if you bypass the Philippines, I am going to present a challenge to you politically. Not necessarily to run for the presidency against you, but to undermine your political standing with massive numbers of Americans who will see the betrayal that you, quote unquote, the betrayal that you're committing.
Douglas MacArthur and Franklin Roosevelt may well have struck a deal.
Both men came away convinced that MacArthur would not do anything politically disruptive before the presidential election, and Roosevelt would weigh in on the side of a plan to have a large scale of liberation of at least part of the Philippines, if not all.
Roosevelt wrote MacArthur saying he would push on that plan. There is no evidence he ever did. At the end of July, within days of their meeting, MacArthur's forces were at the western tip of New Guinea.
On August 1st, 1944, my father had the radio turned on to listen to the news. And the news came that the Americans had landed in an island 800 miles from the Philippines. And my father said, only 800 miles.
Manuel Quezon would never follow MacArthur's bayonets back to the Philippines. He died an hour later. On September 8th, the Joint Chiefs informed MacArthur he could advance to the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. They made no decision on what lay next, Luzon or Formosa. A week later, he landed on an island north of New Guinea, only 300 miles from the southern Philippines. He gazed out to sea, an aide recalled, as though he could glimpse through the clouds the rugged mountains of Bataan and the charred spine of Corregidor. They are waiting for me there, he said. It has been a long time. Just days before, planes from Navy carriers had bombed the southern Philippines. Then Leyte, further north. They met little resistance. Admiral Halsey wired Admiral Nimitz in Honolulu, recommending an earlier landing at Leyte. Nimitz forwarded the cable to the Joint Chiefs, offering MacArthur the Navy's support. The Joint Chiefs advanced the date of the Leyte landing, then decided the issue MacArthur felt so strongly about. The Luzon-Formosa question was resolved, not on the basis of institutional loyalties, not on the morality of bypassing tortured prisoners, but on logistics.
One of the problems with invading Formosa is that it's logistically difficult. The Navy has moved across the Central Pacific rather rapidly, and in order to accumulate the men and material to invade Formosa would take too long. It would mean the Pacific War would have to stagnate for a couple of months, and no American military planner wants that. They want to keep the ball rolling. They want to continue to advance on Japan.
The Navy's success in the bitter rivalry helped to assure MacArthur's redemption. The Leyte invasion would mark the beginning of his liberation of the Philippines. complained about a lack of shipping. No longer. Tell Arthur, he wrote his wife Jean from the cruiser Nashville, that we have more than 600 ships, and that as far as I can see in all directions, there are nothing but ships. With all love to you both, I'll be thinking of you tomorrow when I go in. On October 20th, MacArthur went ashore, the last four-star general to exercise command at the front. His 2.5-year quest was over.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. Rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled.
10 days after the landing, a MacArthur communique said Leyte was secure. But the fighting, journalists noted, had hardly begun. The elections are coming up in a few days, a press officer explained. If MacArthur had made a deal to give FDR good news before the election, he delivered on that day.
Speaking of the glorious operations in the Philippines, I wonder whatever became of the suggestion made a few weeks ago that I had failed for political reasons to send enough forces or supplies to General MacArthur.
In December, Roosevelt promoted MacArthur and his other top generals and admirals to 5-star rank. Within days, Admiral Nimitz paid a visit.
MacArthur was there to greet us at the bottom of the gangway. And when he saw the 5-star, you could see this frown come in his face. And later on, I understood from his aide that he was furious that the Admiral had outshone him by having 5 stars on. And General MacArthur had his staff stay up all night filing down Philippine 10-cent pieces to make 5 stars. Next morning at breakfast, he appeared with 5 stars.
In early January 1945, MacArthur headed for Luzon. As he passed Corregidor and Bataan, he remembered that black night 3 years gone when I churned through these same waters with only the determination to return. I felt an indescribable sense of sorrow, of loneliness, and of solemn consecration. He headed for Manila, the city where his mother had died, where he had courted his wife, where his son had been born. In liberating the city he loved, he would help to destroy it.
More than 3 years have elapsed. Years of earnest struggle and sacrifice. Since I withdrew our forces and installations from this beautiful city, that its churches and cultural centers might be spared the violence of military ravage. The enemy would not have it so. By these ashes, he has wantonly fixed the future pattern of his own doom.
MacArthur could not finish this speech. He broke down and recited the Lord's Prayer.
If my father could have seen what happened in the Philippines, and if he could have known the atrocities that had been committed by the Japanese, it certainly would have broken his heart, as it did ours when we first came home. Manila was destroyed. There was nothing at all.
Only 1/3 of the men MacArthur left behind had survived the war. There were burial details every day. Here was all that was left of my men of Bataan and Corregidor, he wrote. I looked down the lines of men with suffering and torture written on their gaunt faces. Each man, barely speaking above a whisper, said, "You're back," or "You made it," or "God bless you." I could only reply, "I'm a little late, but we finally came." MacArthur had not seen his family for more than 4 months. On his 65th birthday in January, Jean wrote, "I send all my love to you, and may it help to form a mantle of protection for you. I love you more than you will ever know. May we be able to share in peace many more of your birthdays together. God bless you, Jeannie." In May, the Joint Chiefs put MacArthur in command of the invasion of Japan. His planning had barely begun when the war ended abruptly in August. The atomic bomb was developed by the Army, carried to a Pacific island by the Navy, dropped on Japan by the Air Force. MacArthur had nothing to do with it. He was indignant when he learned that General Eisenhower had known of the bomb before he was told. To reporter Theodore White, he said, "White, do you know what this means? Men like me are obsolete. There will be no more wars, White. No more wars." With World War II over, America's new president, Harry Truman, had to decide who would take the surrender and preside over the occupation of Japan. In his diary, he derided MacArthur as Dugout Doug, a stuffed shirt, Mr. Prima Donna, brass hat, 5-star MacArthur, but he needed him.
MacArthur was considered the Republican general in the Pacific, and he, Truman, had to appease Republican sentiment by appointing him. And Tokyo was far away. It was as far away from Washington as you could get, and that had certain political advantages.
MacArthur informed Truman he would take the surrender at the American embassy in Tokyo. Truman informed MacArthur he was sending the battleship Missouri. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, nearly 260 warships lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay.
American ships, ships of the British fleet, and a few other ships from other nations were there as far as the eye could see, except for our aircraft carriers. They were offshore with destroyer screen, and our patrol planes were overhead. And we weren't taking any chances.
When I studied Japanese as a kid, one of the phrases in the school book was, "We, nation of 90 million, never once in battle defeated. Ruled over by a dynasty seated upon the throne since before the beginning of the memory of men." There was no defeat in Japanese history. He wanted to make sure the Japanese knew.
When the Germans surrendered to Eisenhower, the thing was done in the middle of the night. It was done more or less in private. MacArthur was not going to have anything like that. It would be a public ceremony. It would not be an exercise in triumphalism. It will be a quasi-religious experience bringing the slaughter to an end.
He held that surrender off until the 2nd of September so that the Chinese, the British, the Russians, the Filipinos, and other occupied peoples could appear in full uniform and participate. He understood the political importance of a grand ceremony. He also understood the political importance of announcing the peace would be generous.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
If you look at the lineup of generals and admirals on the deck of the Missouri, these are men who had personal losses at the hands of the Japanese. What MacArthur did was to create a ceremony of victory, to show these men that they had achieved this marvelous success, but also to show them that there was a transition into a peacetime period when their behavior and their view of Japan was going to have to become quite different.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion, a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding.
MacArthur conducted that ceremony with extreme dignity, with carefully chosen words, but at no point said anything that could be interpreted as gloating, interpreted as baiting a beaten enemy. I thought it was the most dramatic, most moving ceremony I've ever witnessed.
For me, who expected the worst humiliation, diplomat Toshikazu Kase remembered, this was a complete surprise. For the living heroes and dead martyrs of the war, this speech was a wreath of undying flowers. This narrow quarterdeck was now transformed into an altar of peace. On September 8, 1945, MacArthur arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo with a new title, SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers, and a new challenge, rehabilitating and democratizing a country of 70 million people.
He had an enormous intellect, and he threw himself physically and emotionally into every problem, no matter how small it was. And he always sought perfection in everything.
I tried to remember the lessons my own father had taught me as military governor of the Philippines, MacArthur recalled. Arthur MacArthur, a successful reformer, had been removed after a bitter quarrel with Washington. The new Supreme Commander faced his tasks, assailed, he wrote, by the gravest misgivings. Jean's concerns were less complicated. She wanted Arthur to have a normal life in Tokyo. Sergeant, as his father called him, was 8 on his first birthday in Japan, but had no one to play with, except middle-aged generals. They let him win at musical chairs. Life improved when Charles Canada Jr. arrived, the son of the general's new physician.
He was very much a regular kid, but he had a kind of a presence about him that his father had. The kind of presence where you don't have to give a verbal command or demand attention. He would be able to mold the way things were going simply by being who he was.
The embassy was an oasis. Beyond its walls, Tokyo lay in ruins.
You could literally see almost all the way across the city from the firebombs. I mean, it was an empty city, a deserted city. And it was not an unusual case to have 40 or 50 people going through the trash trying to get the whatever food had been thrown away by the American troops. They were hungry.
The starvation concerned MacArthur. He rounded up millions of tons of food set aside for the invasion of Japan and began to feed the Japanese. When Congress balked, he said he would not treat the Japanese as they had his men on Bataan. Besides, he feared riots. "Give me bread," he cabled, "or give me bullets." American soldiers who had braced themselves for a harsh occupation were relieved that the Japanese cooperated.
They accepted the decision of the emperor that we were not to be harmed. And I never had one instance in which I felt apprehensive. Now, we carried arms, to be sure, and in the first 4 or 5 months when there was no lights in the city at all, it was somewhat apprehensive in terms of touring the city. But I never had an instance, and I always attributed that to the fact that at that time, the reverence for the emperor was so intense that they would not violate it.
MacArthur wanted to harness this loyalty to ensure a smooth occupation. To use Hirohito, the god emperor in whose name the Japanese had waged war, for his own ends.
The concept which was very explicit in the intelligence reports MacArthur was reading was drive a wedge between the emperor and the militarists. And we must say the militarists betrayed the emperor. You people now should throw allegiance to the emperor, and we can persuade him to be a leader of democracy.
But MacArthur feared his hands would be tied by America's allies, who wanted to try the emperor as a war criminal. Washington also had not ruled that out. The Japanese feared for their emperor and began to sanitize the record.
この期間中に日本の政府と軍は徹底して軍の
It was the beginning of the occupation. During that 2 weeks, the Japanese government and military had concentrated on destroying and hiding all important official records from MacArthur's headquarters that might cause the emperor to be implicated in war crimes.
GHQ に対して隠そうとしました。
As he approached the embassy to meet MacArthur, Hirohito did not know how much the general knew of his involvement in the war. How, after the bloody conquest of China, he had rewarded his military commanders. How he had known in detail of the plan to attack Pearl Harbor and not moved to stop it. He did not know if MacArthur knew that he could have prevented the execution of captured American pilots. He did not know if MacArthur knew that he had been informed of every kamikaze attack on American ships and had praised the pilots. The God Emperor had no inkling of his fate or that of his throne as he made the unprecedented move to call upon his conqueror.
MacArthur came towards the emperor and said, "Your Majesty, you are very welcome," and swept towards him and shook his hand, and the emperor's hand was shaking. And then MacArthur said, "Tell him that we're going to take one photograph."
That was a very shocking picture. There is MacArthur in an open shirt, as the Japanese press always says, no necktie. There is MacArthur with no necktie and towering over this little man who is the allegedly larger-than-life symbol of the Japanese Empire and the descendant of the sun goddess, looking meek and small.
So, on one side, this is the great symbol for the Japanese that the emperor is no longer the supreme power in the land. But the other side of the picture is much more interesting, and that is, I'm standing by the emperor. This is the symbol that I will stand by you, and that I will indeed welcome your presence.
The two men then met alone with the emperor's interpreter. MacArthur wrote that the emperor said, "I come to you to bear sole responsibility for every action taken by my people in the conduct of the war."
I would not want to say that five-star General of the Army Douglas MacArthur told a prevarication. Maybe we could say he elaborated on the truth. I don't think the emperor said that I'm responsible and I accept the full blame for all that happened. I think MacArthur felt it would have been nice if the emperor did say it, and it'd be very nice for the outside world to think that he said it. And so MacArthur put those words into his mouth.
In fact, years later, it was discovered that the emperor's own interpreter had kept his account of the interview, and MacArthur does all the talking and tells him how he knows how he's fought for peace and how war is a terrible thing and how, he respects the emperor. And the emperor never makes any grand statement about accepting responsibility.
When the emperor departed, he was visibly more relaxed and said he hoped to see MacArthur many more times. Imperial censors then moved to prevent publication of the photograph. MacArthur overruled them. As nothing else could, a Japanese observer noted, This convinced a shocked nation that Japan was truly beaten. MacArthur then announced a program of sweeping reforms, implementing policies from Washington, initiating others, taking credit for them all. He abolished the secret police and insisted the press be free, but not to criticize him. He emancipated Japanese women and liberalized education, demanding the study of democracy. He turned over land to the peasants who farmed it and encouraged laborers to unionize. He purged wartime leaders and released political prisoners, including hundreds of communists. MacArthur felt he was imposing America's Bill of Rights in a carefully controlled revolution. Japan's conservative government complained he was turning the country red. The Supreme Commander was in control, but not as much as he thought.
What happens a few months after this is an extraordinarily subtle choreography in which the imperial court begins to invite SCAP officials, top military and civilian people in the occupation command, to the imperial grounds to partake in imperial activities. And the one that the military men, the American military men, are so fascinated by is the imperial duck hunt.
I was handed this huge net that was bigger than I was, and I was led over to a water-filled channel where ducks were swimming, and I was told that I should reach in and scoop them up, and that was the whole idea of the game. So I thought that was wonderful. I'd never heard of anything like this before, and it was absolutely grand to be able to do it.
So there, all these top brass are running around waving their butterfly nets and getting imperial ducks. And there's no greater royalists in Japan than the Americans. They love this proximity to the throne. And in this way, they're kind of brought into this wonderful, gentle tradition. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant on the part of the Japanese side to say, you know, here's what we are. Here's the court, and here's what we really are, a gentle people. It's like the chrysanthemum and the sword. We're really the chrysanthemum, the sword. That wasn't part of us.
While the palace courted MacArthur's entourage, he was working to ensure the emperor's survival before the formation of an Allied commission that might urge his indictment as a war criminal. In January 1946, he wired Eisenhower, then Army Chief of Staff, that after as complete a research as was possible, he could find no evidence the emperor was responsible for the war.
The cable said the material which could prove the emperor's responsibility for the war could not be found, and included the warning that if the emperor was to be indicted, the country will be in chaos. Except there are absolutely no records of MacArthur seriously searching for or gathering any material relating to the emperor and his war responsibilities.
MacArthur ordered his staff to draft a constitution in 1 week. He wanted to present the Allies with a new document protecting the civil liberties he had introduced and preserving an emperor stripped of power. When it was presented to Foreign Minister Yoshida Shigeru and the cabinet, they were stunned to discover the emperor had less power than a British monarch.
The Japanese, of course, wanted just the opposite. They wanted the emperor to be as strong as possible. And this is what caused so many hours of debate, because they looked at it from completely different points of view. And so they started arguing about every word. Where we wanted symbol of the state, which is a weak word, they wanted head of state. One of them said to one of the Japanese government officials, now, you know, General MacArthur actually would like to keep the emperor from being tried as a war criminal. It would help him a lot if you accepted the basic principles of this constitutional draft.
MacArthur presented another shocker. One of his earliest acts as Supreme Commander had been to disarm Japan. He now demanded a clause in the Constitution that would prevent Japan from ever waging war again.
Without MacArthur, there would never have been a line in the Constitution that says Japan, you know, outlaws war and the rights of belligerency of the state. These kind of things came from him. And it's quite a remarkable, grand accomplishment, because here is a man who has given his life to war, who comes in and says to them, war is horrendous and we cannot do it anymore, and you Japanese have the opportunity to be a pacifist state.
The government was terrified about what the emperor would think of MacArthur's constitution. Reluctantly, they presented it to the palace.
He's not happy with being an emperor and stripped of all political power, but he accepts the Constitution because this guarantees that whatever happens to him, the imperial house has been preserved.
Hirohito urged legislators to accept MacArthur's constitution, placing power in the hands of the people. He would now present himself, as MacArthur wanted to see him, as Japan's first Democrat. Conservative leaders felt the document had been rammed down their throats.
Of course, the Japanese government was horrified because this was, to them, unbelievably revolutionary. But that was the government. That was not the people. The people were very happy. They immediately rallied to protect the Constitution in every way.
No longer is the future to be settled by the few, MacArthur told the Japanese people as he urged them to vote for a new government. On April 10th, 1946, 3 out of 4 Japanese did vote, including 14 million women, for the first time. A vast majority of those they voted for were committed to the new constitution. Only 6 were wartime leaders. 5 were communists. And, best of all, MacArthur said, there were 38 women. He had checkmated the Allies. They could not now undo reforms validated by popular vote. The Japanese knew they had a new ruler, and that the center of power had shifted. Each day they watched MacArthur come and go with reverent silence. You have a feeling, a reporter wrote, that people almost bow when they mention General MacArthur's name. MacArthur wanted to show that the Japanese people accepted their new democratic emperor.
They begin to have the emperor travel to different places in Japan and meet the people. The emperor has never mixed with the people.
On this precedent-shattering occasion, Hirohito conversed with many of his subjects, very different from the days when his people were even forbidden to look upon the sacred presence.
There was a wonderful line in the Japanese press. It says, the emperor came and talked. He didn't have much to say. He looked like someone who had just come out of a box. And his awkwardness often took the form of him saying, ah, so, which means, oh, is that so? And this was the way he responded, and it became kind of a joke. And he's so sincere and awkward. It really conveys an image that he was indeed a man innocent of any war responsibility.
And when you come to the year 1947, The touring emperor's encounters with his people are more choreographed, and they become great events with tens and tens of thousands of people lining the streets and people waving the flag. And Americans watch this, foreigners watch this, and they say they have become victory tours.
The palace had once again parlayed a MacArthur initiative to its own advantage. It had turned the promotion of a democratic emperor into traditional emperor worship. MacArthur ordered the tours discontinued. In contrast to the emperor, the Supreme Commander's remoteness was becoming legendary. He vowed he would never break bread with the Japanese, and with an overwhelming workload, seldom socialized with anyone.
He would entertain at lunch. If he would entertain at all, he would be back at work at 5 p.m. And then the real work day started, and we would be there till maybe 9:30 p.m. if we were lucky. If there was a problem to be solved, he would want to solve it before he quit. This occurred 7 days a week. Christmas, New Year's, anniversary dates were not considered.
In 5 years, MacArthur saw nothing of the country he was trying to reform. Instead, he encouraged Jean to act as his eyes and ears. She traveled on the imperial train.
And when we get to a stop, they would roll out the red carpet, and the officials of the town would be there to greet us, and we would be treated literally like royalty. Every place we went, they tried to entertain us and amuse us, so there was never a dull moment.
For Charles and Arthur, the most exciting trip was to Mikimoto's pearl farm.
They took us out in boats, and we saw these young women diving for the oysters and bringing them up in their baskets. And then they had a special surprise when the meal was served. We opened the oysters and getting ready to eat them, but instead of the normal, what you'd expect to find inside an oyster, there'd be these beautiful, big pearls. And Arthur and I fell to taking the pearls and playing marbles with them. Well, it took a few minutes for Mrs. MacArthur and my mother to realize what was going on. And they swooped down, scooped up the pearls, and took them away from us. Mrs. MacArthur said, "You're living through a very special time of your life. You must savor it, you must enjoy it, because in a certain number of years, we'll be going back to being ordinary mortals once we leave the occupation."
Despite MacArthur's protection, the emperor watched nervously as the Tokyo war crimes trials unfolded. MacArthur had encouraged the palace to finger the military leaders as the guilty ones. This tactic almost backfired. 28 war leaders were indicted. General Tojo topped the list. The palace had accused Tojo of abusing his power as prime minister to authorize the attack on Pearl Harbor.
At one moment, Tojo just frankly said, there's no way that we would have done anything against the emperor's wishes. And the prosecution and MacArthur's headquarters were so alarmed that they actually sent people in to Tojo to tell him to make sure he corrected that statement.
In a staged cross-examination, Tojo swore the emperor had always been a man of peace and never wanted war. The emperor survived. Tojo and 6 other loyal subjects were hanged. As the trials ended in 1948, members of the imperial court, knowing the throne was secure, wanted Hirohito to accept his responsibility for the war by abdicating.
MacArthur said, no, don't abdicate. And as a result of this, from the Japanese perspective, you have a man who becomes America's symbol of democracy, who is totally sanitized by the Americans, and by MacArthur in particular, from not even expressing real responsibility for decisions, but moral responsibility for the horrors that took place in his name. And I think that that poisoned the thinking about responsibility in general in Japan to the present day.
He didn't care about the emperor personally, except as a tool for his own magnification. MacArthur wanted the occupation to be his last shining, glorious hour.
In March 1947, MacArthur looked at Japan and was pleased. His land reform had ended what he called a system of virtual slavery and put 90% of the land in the hands of the farmers. Public health programs had saved millions of lives. The progress he had made transforming Japan in America's image was there for the world to see.
Children of occupation families and Japanese youngsters alike ride in the events. Young Arthur MacArthur uses the trick jumps to get some trick shots. The horses don't kick over the traces, but the Emperor's children certainly do. Not those for their highnesses yet. Next thing, they'll be wearing bobby sogs.
I think for MacArthur, establishing a record of positive liberal reformist achievement in Japan was an important part of his political resurrection in the United States. It would make up for the lapses of the Bonus March. It would show people that he wasn't just a commander, he wasn't just a great general, but he was someone who could take a defeated nation, democratize it, make it better than it was, along an American model.
MacArthur feared a prolonged occupation could foster resentment. It was time, he said, to bring the troops home and sign a peace treaty. He planned to run for president in 1948 on his achievement in Japan.
He announces that everything is fine in Japan. The only thing that's wrong is the occupation's going on too long. The Americans can just go home. Peace has been achieved.
The general's announcement shocked Truman. In 1947, he looked at Japan and saw trouble. The post-war economy was in shambles. Business leaders who prospered during the war now had little incentive to rebuild. His own policy had been to purge them and dismantle their monopolies. Labor leaders, including communists, emboldened by MacArthur's reforms, threatened to shut the country down. Truman saw Japan weakened at a time when the Soviet Union was extending its power over Eastern Europe. And Mao Zedong's communists were sweeping across China. It was no time, Truman felt, to bring the troops home.
With the Cold War heating up, the Truman administration announced that the fundamental American security policy would be the containment of the Soviet Union through the rebuilding, what they called the two great workshops of Europe and Asia, Germany and Japan. That had dire implications for Douglas MacArthur and his occupation policy. It meant, first of all, there wouldn't be any quick end to the occupation because the American policy would now be to continue the occupation until economic stability had been achieved. The other thing it implied was that MacArthur had done something wrong.
Having taken credit for Washington's policies, he now took the blame. He was accused of making Japan vulnerable to communism. MacArthur felt he could control the communists. He also knew he had neither the time nor the money to rebuild the economy before the elections.
From his Tokyo headquarters, General Douglas MacArthur announces that he will accept the presidency if called by the American people. The 68-year-old Pacific Supreme Commander adds, however, that he will not actively seek nomination.
The New York Times predicted a MacArthur victory in the Wisconsin primary. One who worked with him wondered why.
He was 19th century. He wasn't 20th century. And he used such colorful words when he said, "Were I not to run for the presidency, I would be recreant to my duty." Who uses the word recreant? And everyone ran and looked it up in the dictionary.
In March 1948, on the eve of the Republican primaries, Truman dispatched Undersecretary of the Army William Draper to convince the general to follow Washington's new plans. MacArthur ignored him.
And MacArthur's view was, until he got an order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to do this, he wasn't going to pay any attention to it. People in Washington could think this was a good idea, but he would only do what he thought was right to carry out the policies he previously had.
From his perspective, Washington's decision to reverse the policies that Washington had ordered him to implement, I think any human being would be resentful of that. But I do also think his memory of his father's difficulties, his father's sliding at the hands of Army bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, is a crucial factor in shaping his attitude.
MacArthur had many admirers in Tokyo. Unfortunately for him, their votes did not count. His dismal showing in Wisconsin, where he was considered a native son, effectively ended his campaign. After his defeat, an aide remarked, "The general is as low as a rug." With MacArthur no longer a political threat, Truman sent a Detroit banker, Joseph Dodge, to Tokyo with a title of Ambassador Extraordinary, so MacArthur could not ignore him. Dodge began to rebuild, not reform, Japan's economy, and help the old monopolies regroup. Japan's conservative leaders rejoiced. The emperor was also losing confidence in MacArthur. Because of the general's pacifist constitution, Hirohito feared for Japan's security and wanted U.S. troops to remain. He began to bypass MacArthur and develop direct access to Washington. In the late 1940s in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur found himself, as he had in the late 1930s in Manila, isolated from power. He was rescued once again by war. On June 25, 1950, communist North Korean troops attacked South Korea across the 38th parallel. The Korean War was underway. Truman committed U.S. forces. MacArthur would command them. When the United Nations joined the war, he became UN commander.
Harry Truman didn't like the kind of general MacArthur was. He saw him as a show-off. He didn't like the bravado, the theatrical kind of general that MacArthur was. But he certainly recognized MacArthur's ability.
At age 70, Douglas MacArthur was in a major war for the third time in his life. He rushed to the front all that he had, ill-equipped and out-of-shape occupation forces. They were no match for Soviet-built tanks and well-trained North Korean troops. Within a month, the U.S. 8th Army had retreated to a defensible line around the port of Pusan.
We were under strength, we were under-equipped, we were really struggling to hang on for our lives. But we just had this feeling that MacArthur back in Tokyo, he knows what's happening and somehow he's going to do something to help.
Before MacArthur could rescue his entrapped army, he got embroiled in an argument with Truman that almost cost him his job. When Chinese nationalists, America's World War II allies, lost the Civil War, they fled to the island of Formosa, later called Taiwan. MacArthur was dismayed when Truman said the U.S. would not defend Formosa. When the Korean War broke out, Truman wanted to defend Formosa, but without provoking the communists. He sent veteran diplomat Averell Harriman to Tokyo to make sure MacArthur understood. MacArthur did, Harriman told Truman, but without full conviction. He told a diplomat in Tokyo that one of these days he intended to blast Truman's State Department wide open.
He regarded the people in Washington as very timorous and very unable to reach decisions. And he felt that Washington needed a decision, and he knew no one better than he who could provide better decisions than MacArthur. This is MacArthur.
MacArthur tried to nudge Truman toward an aggressive defense of Formosa in a letter to a veterans group. Truman was livid at MacArthur's meddling in policy and considered firing him. But he backed off. It was a critical moment in the war. MacArthur was about to embark on a bold plan to free his beleaguered army. He would land behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon and cut North Korea's supply lines. The 8th Army could then break out of its enclave around Pusan. When Harriman was in Tokyo, MacArthur had asked him for the forces he would need.
MacArthur said to Harriman, "I cannot believe that a great nation like the United States cannot give me these few paltry reinforcements for which I ask. Tell the President that if he gives them to me, I will land at Incheon on the rising tide at daybreak on the 15th of September, and between the hammer of this landing and the anvil of the 8th Army, I will shatter and destroy the armies of North Korea."
The Joint Chiefs were nervous about the plan. They flew to Tokyo to express their concerns.
The chiefs all had their say. At the end, MacArthur took that corncob pipe out of his mouth and clanked it into the ashtray, stood up, and he said, "Gentlemen, I will be landing in Incheon this September, or you will have another commander."
On the same day, August 23rd, China's Chairman Mao studied a military assessment of MacArthur. It stressed his genius and his arrogance.
Mao said, okay, was he arrogant, stubborn? That's fine. The more arrogant, the more stubborn he is, the better, because an arrogant and stubborn enemy is easy to defeat.
On September 13th, 1950, MacArthur's armada headed for the port of Incheon. With its narrow channel and mud. That is what worried the Joint Chiefs. At low tide, the harbor is a mudflat. 3 miles of mudflat. A landing force would be stranded for almost 12 hours. until the next high tide. It was a risky but unlikely place for a landing. As in World War II, he would hit them where they ain't. Despite his confidence, he confessed to an aide the plan was a tremendous gamble. He headed for shore, a destroyer captain observed, in a Napoleonic pose. He was nauseous when he got there.
And we thought, how in the world did he manage to gather together a force? And it was a real lifting of our spirits down south, and of course it broke the pressure, and we were able to then to start driving north. And it was just the greatest feeling that suddenly the tide had turned, and when we had been just days before fighting for our lives.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley called the landing a dazzling victory. MacArthur's forces recaptured South Korea's capital, Seoul, within days. Then headed north for the 38th parallel. The UN's original mandate was to restore South Korea. Now it became reunify Korea, provided there was no major Soviet or Chinese intervention. MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel.
And Truman supported. They were, as we would say, pumped up. They were excited. Victory was very close. It was standard military doctrine that you chase and destroy the enemy's army. And that's what they were going to do, and they crossed that parallel.
MacArthur was told that only South Korean troops could approach the Yalu River, the border with China. He bridled at such interference from Washington. MacArthur spat blood at Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a British diplomat wired London.
Not only they crossed the 38th parallel, they were marching toward the Chinese-Korean border. Who should believe, who can believe that they would stop at the Chinese-Korean border?
The day after UN forces crossed into North Korea, Truman requested a meeting with MacArthur.
MacArthur said it's very important. It's a very crucial stage of the war, and I don't want to go that far away. So Truman offered to go halfway, and someone brought up Wake Island, which is much more than halfway, which is about 2/3 of the way.
Truman, I think, surely knew that MacArthur looked down at him. MacArthur looked down just about everybody, but particularly Harry Truman, who he saw as this reserve captain from World War I and a little small-time politician. What did he know?
"I've a whale of a job before me," Truman wrote from the plane. "Have to talk to God's right-hand man tomorrow." In 1944, FDR had met the hero of the Pacific several months before presidential elections. Truman would meet the hero of Incheon just weeks before congressional elections.
MacArthur was at the foot of the ramp waiting for Truman when he came down.
And when Mr. Truman stepped on the ground, MacArthur shook hands with him very effusively, as did Truman. I did notice that he had not saluted him, which struck me as somewhat odd.
But he didn't do it. No, he didn't salute his commander-in-chief, and Harry Truman noticed that.
I don't think it was intended as disrespectful. I think he never saluted first. Everybody always saluted him, so he returned the salute. But he was not in the habit of saluting first. There was nobody to salute, not the emperor, not anybody. And then they got in a vehicle.
One Secret Service agent remembered the two chatted without rancor. Another claimed Truman bawled out MacArthur. "I'm the commander-in-chief. You're just a general. Remember that. Why do you insist on going into China? We don't want to do that." The general session took place in a communications shack.
And President Truman said to General MacArthur, "I'm very concerned with the Chinese massing troops along the border. Do you think they will intervene?" To which the reply was, "Mr. President, this is not the hour of our weakness. This is the hour of our strength. If the Chinese cross the Yalu, I will make of them the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. They have no means for giving ground air support to the ground troops. And they cannot do it, and I do not believe they will."
MacArthur had a reasonable estimation that the Chinese army crossing the Yalu might be poorly commanded, although skilled in guerrilla warfare, would not be skilled against American air, against American heavy artillery concentrations, against American armor, and against American tactical infantry.
And of course, one has to remember the psychology of it. He's a victorious general. He's just reversed the tide of the war. The force is with him in a way. And he believed that it would continue if only you persisted just a little bit longer.
President Truman asked General MacArthur when he thought the war would be over. General MacArthur replied that he didn't know, but he thought it would be over by Christmas, and that he would be able to give 2 divisions for NATO in Europe in the beginning of the new year.
Truman very understandably accepts that, believes it. Why shouldn't he? And MacArthur believed it. It wasn't MacArthur was trying to pull something over the president's head or to speak irresponsibly.
The Chinese troops which crossed the Yalu in October were the best units of the People's Liberation Army, but they were under the name of the Chinese People's Volunteers. Mao believed that this would reduce the possibility of a formal war between China and the United States.
On October 24th, 1950, MacArthur ordered his commanders to drive forward with all speed for the Yalu River.
As we were moving north towards the Yalu, we began to confront organized units of regular Chinese forces. And we would immediately report that back to Tokyo, and we would be reassured that no, this was not that at all. These were volunteers, and they were token volunteers, and they shouldn't disconcert us too much.
MacArthur ordered an air campaign to lay waste the Korean side of the Yalu River. The Chinese, it seemed, were a threat. Fearing a wider war, Truman began to rein in his commander. He prohibited airstrikes within 5 miles of the border unless MacArthur's forces were in immediate danger. The hero of Incheon said they were in danger. On the eve of the congressional elections, he threatened to hold Truman responsible for American blood that would flow from every hour of delay. Washington relented. The Air Force began to encounter Soviet MiG fighters based in China. MacArthur wanted to chase them into China and destroy their bases. Truman again said no, and considered stopping UN troops well short of the Yalu River. MacArthur had successfully badgered Washington in World War II. "I recommend with all the earnestness I possess," his cable now read, "that we press on to complete victory." Once again, MacArthur got his way. After 2 weeks, the Chinese attacks suddenly stopped. The lull in the battle was reassuring.
This Thanksgiving Day was sparkled with rumors of possible peace in Korea. There are a certain number of facts behind the rumors. There has been the unexplained withdrawal of the Chinese troops. UN forces have
The 8th Army headed for the Yalu. On the other side of what MacArthur thought were impenetrable mountains, the Marines headed for a reservoir they called Frozen Chosen.
At this point, the Chinese were playing with MacArthur's arrogance by creating a kind of image that the UN forces under MacArthur's command was winning a military victory. Actually, the Chinese troops were preparing some deadly traps for MacArthur's forces.
MacArthur flew to the front to witness the final offensive. His communique that day read, "This should, for all practical purposes, end the war." On November 26th, more than 300,000 Chinese and North Korean troops streamed out of the mountains and fell upon the UN forces.
When we got to the Yalu River, sure enough, we found, like Custer, where did all these Chinese come from? The hills were black with these people. I've never seen so many people in all my life. It was a very frightening experience.
The entire UN front was in disarray. Douglas MacArthur faced his biggest defeat since his forces surrendered on Bataan almost 9 years before. Once again, he felt it personally.
MacArthur had a very keen feeling for the West Point graduates. Their attrition rate was astonishing. About a third of the class, I think, of 1950 that was killed in that conflict. He would always ask me, what about Trent? What about Tom Lombardo? These were company commanders and platoon leaders that were great Army football players at West Point. And I knew when I'd have to tell him that, well, Tom was killed today, he would get tears in his eyes and have to go back to his office and then resume the briefing later.
Arthur was almost 13 that Christmas of 1950. He would have known how much his father revered West Point, how much his father looked forward to his being sworn in as a cadet. He would have known that he had been named for a grandfather who had been the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Army. His father had encouraged him in riding lessons, his mother in music lessons, which he preferred. That Christmas, he gave one of his concerts, which included compositions of his own. As usual, the embassy staff and their families attended, as did his father.
I never thought about the fact that the general had all these incredible demands on his time, but he never missed one. He would make time, no matter how late it was at night. He would come in and tuck us in and talk to us about how our day had gone. And I think those visits in the evening, even though it might be late, made up for a lot. We'd tell him these trivial things that we had done, and whether we'd had a Cub Scout meeting, whether we'd played cowboys and Indians. It didn't make any difference how inconsequential it would be in the grand scheme of things. He wanted to hear it.
MacArthur spared Arthur the strains he was under, but not Jean. "I feel as if the walls are closing in on me," she confided to a friend. It seemed that she was likely to collapse, her friend wrote. She lost weight. She couldn't sleep. She picked at her food. She suffered for her husband. He was flying through Korea more often and working longer hours. As 1951 began, Douglas MacArthur, almost 71, was fighting the battle of his life. After the Chinese offensive in late November, his forces began a 300-mile retreat, the longest in U.S. military history. He asked Washington for reinforcements. He wanted to use Chinese troops from Formosa, in Korea and on the Chinese mainland. He wanted to blockade China's ports and bomb its industrial base. Truman refused all of this. He decided not to expand the war.
I think it was one of the most important decisions of the whole Truman second term. They decided what was going to be the policy from then on, a limited war, because they're deathly afraid, understandably and rightly, of this flaring up into a world war. And by then, of course, the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb.
MacArthur told the press the restrictions on him were a handicap without precedent in military history. General MacArthur, as usual, has been shooting off his mouth, Truman wrote in his diary.
The more people that President Truman sent out from Washington to talk to General MacArthur, the more General MacArthur became convinced that Washington didn't have an end plan, an end game, that its sense of how to end the war simply wasn't clear enough to provide the direction a military man needed to conduct the war.
MacArthur threatened Washington with a dire choice. His forces, which had retreated below the 38th parallel, faced annihilation or evacuation to Japan unless he could expand the war. He had a new field commander in 1951, General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was more optimistic. He accepted Washington's restrictions, rallied the troops, and headed north.
Ridgway took hold of the 8th Army, grabbed it by the throat, gave it a good shake, and straightened it out. He reformed a line across the peninsula, one coast to the other. And then he began a deliberate, buttoned-up offensive, a step at a time. Good artillery support, good air support. Identify your objectives and take them.
Ridgway exposed as false MacArthur's choice of annihilation or evacuation. The Pentagon began to look to him for military assessments, to regard MacArthur as a prima donna figurehead who had to be tolerated. In February, Ridgway ordered a big offensive toward Seoul. MacArthur told reporters he had ordered the offensive. Ridgway saw this as an unwelcome round. In March, the 8th Army, under Ridgway, recaptured Seoul. Then headed for the 38th parallel. For Truman and the Allies, that was enough. They would go no farther north. They settled for the UN's original mandate, restoring South Korea. Truman prepared to make a ceasefire offer to China.
General MacArthur faced the prospect. Politicians have decided to end the war in a position where militarily we are not necessarily where we would like to be. How is this going to happen? What should we do?
Just recapturing Seoul and moving back, getting back to the 38th parallel does not remove the military threat to South Korea.
In Tokyo, one observer found MacArthur tired and depressed. In Korea, another thought he was exhausted, a beaten man. He had been humiliated by the Chinese, proved wrong by Ridgway, marginalized by the Pentagon. And now Truman wanted to sue for peace. to thwart an expanded war with China, which he, MacArthur, would direct from Tokyo. Perhaps this realization, General Bradley wrote, snapped his brilliant but little mind. Others felt he responded not with a cracked, but a calculating mind. One was a longtime aide, General Courtney Whitney.
It is the assessment of General Whitney that General MacArthur felt this was the time to leave the service because he felt so strongly about the issue. And what was the issue? The issue was winning the war.
MacArthur went public, and he practically forced Truman to relieve him.
MacArthur went public with his own peace proposal. He threatened China with imminent destruction, then envisioned a peace that suggested a settlement at the Yalu. But not by diplomats. MacArthur himself would meet the Chinese commander in the field, as great men did in centuries past. Truman viewed MacArthur's statement as premeditated sabotage and decided to fire him when the time was right. He would not have to wait long. 2 weeks later, House Minority Leader Joseph Martin made public a letter from MacArthur endorsing Martin's desire to use troops from Formosa. There is, MacArthur warned, no substitute for victory. He wanted to win, as he had won in 2 world wars. He worried that fighting at an indefensible line could be endless. What he feared is what happened. The war, then 9 months old, would continue as a stalemate for more than 2 years. America would suffer another 50,000 casualties. MacArthur's quarrel with Truman was about more than the goals of the war. It was about who should be in charge. His father had told him he must do what was right for his country, no matter what the personal sacrifice might be.
Blind loyalty to a commander of a unit or even a president must be overwhelmed by one's subjective perception of the best interest of the people. And I think MacArthur was driven by that. I happen to think it's the right solution. It can be very costly to an individual.
He was forgetting what he had learned at West Point, that the commander-in-chief is the supreme commander. And he told Samuel Eliot Morrison, the historian, that he didn't agree with that. He thought that in the field, the general should decide, that only he knew the situation. And when Morrison seemed a little surprised, he said it a second time, just to be sure that Morrison knew that he wasn't being misquoted.
For Truman, the letter to Congressman Martin was the last straw. When he got word MacArthur might resign, he was heard to say, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. He's going to be fired."
I considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
A group of us were sitting around the embassy, and the announcement came. All our lives as we know it had just ended, and the overall atmosphere was one of stunned silence for the longest period of time. And I think the general must have summoned up every bit of stoicism that he possessed, because he didn't react at all.
Jean had often told Arthur their privileged life would someday end, and they would be mortals once again. As MacArthur lost his supreme command, his former aide Dwight Eisenhower assumed one at NATO. Vernon Walters was with him in Germany when a reporter broke the news.
He said, "General Eisenhower, the president is just fired. General MacArthur, for insubordination. Do you have any comment? And Eisenhower smiled a strange smile. And then he said, well, you know, when you put on a uniform, you impose certain restrictions on yourself as to what you can do and say.
In Tokyo, the Emperor called upon MacArthur one last time. He overruled his advisors, who said an emperor never visits a person without rank, as MacArthur now was. For the first time, MacArthur walked the emperor to his car. Ordinary Japanese were in shock. We feel as if we have lost a kind and loving father, the Tokyo paper wrote.
He had become, I wouldn't say beloved perhaps, but highly respected by the Japanese, and they were sorry to see him go. And the streets were lined with people, 5 or 6 deep.
The Japanese did not believe anyone was in the position to fire MacArthur. His dismissal, the Japanese scholar argued, was the best lesson in democracy Japan ever had.
General MacArthur was wearing that same old Philippine Army Field Marshal's cap. When he got to the top of the stairs, he turned, and you'd think he was a conquering hero. Not at all the demeanor of a man who'd just been fired. And he entered the airplane with his farewell.
MacArthur had planned a leisurely trip home by boat until Republicans urged him to rush back and address a joint session of Congress.
I have just left your fighting sons in Korea. It was my constant effort to end this savage conflict honorably and with the least loss of time and a minimum sacrifice of life. Its growing bloodshed has caused me the deepest anguish and anxiety. Those gallant men will remain off my thoughts and in my prayers always.
MacArthur's reception in Manhattan the next day was the greatest in U.S. history. It far surpassed Eisenhower's in 1945. Mail that flooded Congress was overwhelmingly against Truman. Nothing, historians have noted, had so stirred the political passions of the country since the Civil War. MacArthur testified for 3 days in Senate hearings. He belittled the risks of a wider war. Had one occurred, he said, the responsibility would have rested with Washington, not with him. He seemed, a senator noted, to be making Truman's case. He told Congress that George Marshall and the Joint Chiefs supported his strategy. When they denied this, support for the old soldier in Congress began to fade. For a year, he toured the country giving speeches.
The policies of appeasement on which we are now embarked carry within themselves the very incitation to war against us. Never before has a soldier been called to a rostrum such as this.
By the time he got to the 1952 Republican Convention, popular support for his risky win-the-war program had faded. Another five-star general was the main event.
MacArthur's reaction to news of Eisenhower's nomination was one of complete contempt. He did not believe for a moment that someone who had once been his subordinate could possibly discharge a responsibility that he himself had been denied.
Shortly after he returned, the general took Arthur to West Point. The uniform did not appear to fit. As a youngster, MacArthur wrote the football coach, Arthur saw more of war and death than many soldiers. I have wondered whether it has left a scar on him. After he graduated from school in New York, Arthur went to Columbia and studied literature, opera, and the theater.
He didn't care anything about shooting in war and didn't want any part of it. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to play the piano, possibly act. Those are the things that interested him.
His father had spent a lifetime seeking publicity. Arthur has sought to avoid it. The MacArthurs moved into the Waldorf Towers in New York and became a magnet for world leaders. When she was on her own, Jean continued to keep the general's flame alive. She stopped seeing visitors in 1997, at age 98.
It was only a couple of years before his death. It was at a New York hotel, and I happened to be invited to this luncheon. And suddenly I looked down the corridor, and I saw here came General MacArthur, and he looked at me, and I guess he noticed the combat infantry badge and the Purple Heart and the Silver Star, and certainly he noticed the Korean Service Medal. And instead of just walking on past, he put out his hand and took hold of my shoulders and just shook them. And God, even today, I get chills when I think of that. And that's the magic of MacArthur.
Today marks my final roll call with you. But I want you to know my last conscious thoughts will be of the cause and the cause and the cause.
MacArthur died at age 84, 2 years after his last visit to his beloved West Point. For 5 days, tens of thousands of mourners paid tribute. Eisenhower and Truman were not among them. Prime Minister Yoshida of Japan was.
4 great people in Asia consider him an immense national hero. It's an extraordinary thing for America. He's a life enormously well led. He got up in the morning trying to do good for his country. He took the notions of honor and duty seriously.
One colleague during the Pacific War described him as someone who
combined a sense of courage, vanity, ego, insight. But his greatest fault, he said, was someone who mistook his emotions and ambitions for principles, and he could never distinguish between the two.
MacArthur had had time to think about where he would be buried. West Point was special to him. He would be there in time at the edge of the plain, across from the best clerk he ever had, Ike, who never led a charge. Pleased, no doubt, that he occupied more real estate than Eisenhower. Acknowledging, perhaps, the prominence accorded Washington. There was room at West Point, next to the son of President Ulysses S. Grant. But for Douglas MacArthur, sons of presidents was not presidential enough. He accepted a site that gave him the equivalent of a presidential library, with a museum, an archive, a gift shop, and a splendid place to rest, with room for Jean beside him. Douglas MacArthur was buried as he was born, to the sound of bugles. His funeral was replete with all the ceremony that he had come to cherish as a boy at the Army post at Fort Selden, New Mexico. Unlike his father, he was buried in his Army uniform. On April 11, 1964, one of the greatest soldiers in the history of the United States Army was buried in Norfolk, Virginia, a Navy town.
Each American experience is made possible by Liberty. Liberty Mutual Insurance.
And by Miracle Grow Plant Foods. For flowers, for vegetables, for a beautiful show, for lawns and for shrubs, whatever you grow, a gardener's true friend is Miracle Grow.
Hello, I'm David McCullough. Welcome to the American Experience. They numbered little more than 1,000, and until the emergency, they had been doing mostly what women were expected to do then. They were wives, mothers, waitresses, secretaries, librarians, dancers, socialites, college students. And like their male counterparts, they had come of age during the Great Depression, when jobs of almost any kind were few and very hard to get. But it was the early 1940s, the height of the Second World War, and a call went out such as had never been made before. They volunteered in an experimental Army Air Corps program to see if women could serve as pilots for the military, to release male pilots for combat. Fly Girls, our film, is a subject as pertinent today as it was more than 50 years ago. From the vantage point of the present day, the concerns and biases they had to overcome seem absurd. But the worry that women might not be physically capable of flying military aircraft was very real. With the fiercely determined leadership of Jackie Cochran, one of the most famous pilots of the time, the experiment succeeded beyond all expectations. These pioneer aviators proved they could do the job and then some. This is a wonderful story, told largely by the women themselves. And one further point. In 1977, 33 years after they were disbanded, the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, finally achieved full military recognition when President Jimmy Carter signed a law making them officially veterans. Fly Girls by producer Laurel Ladovich.
In those days, we didn't have movie heroes.
We didn't have rock star heroes. We had the aviators who were pushing back technology, who were doing fantastic things as pioneers. My family would go to the airport every Sunday afternoon, and we would watch the airplanes and look at all of the activity. And that was our standard Sunday afternoon.
Well, I wasn't even of school age. I was 5 years old, and I saw something go across high in the sky, and I didn't know what it was. So I went into my mother, and I said, "Mother, there's something out there, and I want you to get it for me. I want to play with it." I sort of forgot about this, but it was always back there cooking in my subconscious. I got all the way into college, and I still hadn't flown.
Amelia Earhart came to speak to our school. I was in the front row, and she came forward and stood right in front of me, and I felt she was looking right down at me.
Remember, these are years when few women even had driver's licenses. It's not a time where little girls growing up thought, one day I'll fly military airplanes.
Between 1942 and 1944, at the height of World War II, more than 1,000 women left homes and jobs for the opportunity of a lifetime, to become the first in history to fly for the United States military. But the opportunity came at a price. They faced danger and discrimination, and 38 women would die in the line of duty.
This is Texas, cradle of our Army's Air Force. This is an AAF field, too. But over headquarters rides a strange little girl gremlin called Fifinella. And out of those buses are stepping girls. Girls who give a new angle to an Air Force story. They're WASPs, Women's Air Force Service Pilots.
On we go into the wild blue yonder, climbing high into the sun. Here they come zooming to meet our thunder. Attaboys, give her the gun, give her the gun. Down we dive, starting our flame from under. Off with one hell of a roar. We live in fame, we'll go down in flame. Ain't nothing will stop the Air Force now.
The Women's Air Force Service Pilots were the vision of America's most accomplished female flyer, Jacqueline Cochran. Born Bessie Mae Pittman somewhere in the South, she claimed to be an orphan raised by a foster family and to have gone to work in a textile factory at the age of 8. As a teenager, she learned the beauty trade and headed north. On her way to New York City, she picked a new name out of a phone book. Jacqueline Cochran would make herself up as she went along. I might have been born in a hovel, she recalled, but I was determined to travel with the wind and the stars. At the exclusive Saks Fifth Avenue beauty salon, Cochran's clients were wealthy and powerful. Through them, she met the man who would change her life. Floyd Odlum, a financier 15 years her senior, was one of the richest men in America.
I think what she got when she married Floyd, I think, was an opening door for her, because what she saw was the opportunity not only to have drive and initiative, but to use power.
Odlum supported Cochran's ambition, helping her to establish her own cosmetics company, and he encouraged her to fly. Flying would become her passion. In just 10 years, Jackie Cochran would capture 17 world records. With the disappearance of Amelia Earhart in 1937, Cochran became America's most prominent female aviator. In 1938, she won the most prestigious air race in the world, the Transcontinental Bendix. And she received the Harmon Trophy for Outstanding Female Aviator from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt.
Basically, she was very aggressive. If she wanted something, she knew how to get it. And she was a very clever gal, and she's also an outstanding pilot.
Jackie Cochran was one of those people, when I grew up in my house, had the kind of status that Jimmy Doolittle had. People in my family have always respected people who have tenacity of purpose. And Jackie Cochran had tenacity of purpose.
Cochran was enormously energetic and enormously driven. She also had the temperament of seeing everything in the world in terms of black and white, right or wrong, win or lose.
In 1939, when Great Britain declared war on Germany, Jackie made a bold recommendation to Eleanor Roosevelt that American women pilots could serve in a national emergency. Eleanor agreed that women pilots were a weapon waiting to be used. 2 years later, as America moved closer to war, Cochran took her idea to Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces. Arnold suggested that she observe the role women pilots were playing ferrying aircraft throughout Great Britain. Cochran recruited 24 American women to fly for the British.
Today I have seen the most magnificent thing that I ever hoped to see, a very large group of women, and they are doing a job and the most diversified work that I've ever seen done by women.
It was Cochran's understanding that if an American program was needed, it would be hers to command.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
After Pearl Harbor, aircraft production soared from 19,000 planes in 1941 to 48,000 in 1942. Thousands of airplanes needed to be moved from factories to air bases and for shipment overseas. With male pilots being sent to combat duty, there was a severe shortage of pilots at home. In September 1942, Jackie Cochran prepared to return from England, ready to start her own program. But another accomplished aviator was one step ahead. Nancy Love had been quietly lobbying for a select group of experienced women pilots to begin ferrying military aircraft. On September 10th, Love's program was announced.
Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron report to Nancy Harkness Love, their commander, at Newcastle, Delaware. They'll deliver planes to the Army. Although they wear uniform costumes and are trained by Army officers, they have civil service status, not military, and the pay is $3,000 a year. They'll be used in domestic service only. There are only a few WASPs just now, but their ranks are increasing, and every one releases a man flyer for combat duty.
Jackie Cochran is returning from Britain that very day, and she picks up the newspapers, looks at the headlines, which announce the formation of this squadron, and she's outraged.
Cochran stormed into Hap Arnold's office and demanded an explanation. She emerged with her own training program. Not for a select few, but for thousands of women pilots. 10 months later, Nancy Love's WAFs and Jackie Cochran's trainees merged to become the Women Air Force Service Pilots, known as the WASP. Although the two women were supposed to share command, Cochran maneuvered to become director of the entire program. applied. 1,830 women with flying experience were accepted. They were housewives and mothers, co-eds and farm girls, socialites, secretaries, even actresses. One of the first women recruited, Cornelia Fort, was from a prominent family in Nashville, Tennessee. Although her father made his 3 sons promise not to fly, it never occurred to him his daughter would become a pilot.
I can't say exactly why I fly, but I know why, as I've never known anything in my life. I know it in dignity and self-sufficiency and in the pride of skill.
Barbara B.J. Erickson was a home economics major at the University of Washington and an instructor for military pilots.
I got one of the letters and was told that if I wanted to go at my own expense back to Wilmington, Delaware, they would check my records, my logbooks. I would take a physical, could take a flight check, and if I was successful, I would be one of the 25 that they were going to select.
A barnstormer known for her 26 consecutive spins, Teresa James was instructing male pilots in aerobatics when she received her recruitment letter.
Maybe 30 minutes I thought about it and decided to hop a train and go to Wilmington, Delaware.
Dora Doherty was in her junior year at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, when she read about the program in the Chicago Tribune.
I went to take my physical exam, and of course there were thousands of men there taking physical exams. The halls were lined with men. Every room that you looked in, men in there in various states of dress. And when I got to where I was supposed to have my physical, my pulse was so fast that they said I didn't qualify. Well, what's a young 21-year-old girl to do when she is walking through a hotel full of men?
After graduating from Smith College, Anne Baumgartner moved to New York City and became a writer for the New York Times.
I had done a lot of other adventurous things, mountain climbing, training horses, and things like that. And that just seemed like the next step.
Madge Rutherford was finalizing her wedding plans to Sherman Minton when she received a telegram.
And I dropped everything and got Sherman on the phone and said, Sherman, the wedding's off in April. We can get married after I finished my training at Sweetwater, Texas.
Marty Martin turned down a graduate fellowship at the University of Michigan in order to become a WASP. But as she was preparing to leave home, she received a telegram that her physical had not been sent.
And I called up the flight surgeon at Stout Field, and I really was upset. I said, "You've ruined my whole life. I've waited so long to get in this, and you didn't send in my form." And he listened for a long time, and finally he said, "Young lady, you don't speak to colonels like this." So I said, "I'm sorry, but I'm really upset about this." And he said, "I will send it in. But I don't think women should be in the military."
As the site for WASP training, Jackie Cochran chose Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. To her, it was ideal. Wide open, dry, and isolated.
The first night that we were there, we were in a new barracks. We didn't talk about engines, we didn't talk about airplanes, we didn't talk about men. We talked about snakes. Every type of poisonous snake that's found in our country is found in the state of Texas.
The only thing that was bad about Sweetwater were the spiders, tarantulas, and black widows.
But even before they get a chance to take the polish off their nails, it's out onto a dusty Texas drill field with them. Right away, the Air Force wants to get a little muscle on those pretty arms. This scene provides a pretty fair picture of what the girls look like from all angles. None of them are under 21 or over 35.
From sunup to sundown, a trainee's day was consumed by aviation. Jackie Cochran insisted the women receive the same training as male Army Air Force pilots. 200 hours of flight instruction and 400 hours of ground school include navigation, flight theory, instruments, and Morse code. Accommodations were basic. 6 women were assigned to a room, and 12 women shared a single bath.
No privacy, none at all. We just learned to live together.
The all-women's Air Force Base created a sensation. During the first few weeks, over 100 planes with male crews reported mysterious engine problems and requested emergency landings at Avenger Field. Jackie Cochran promptly banned all unauthorized landings. Dating was strictly forbidden, and Avenger Field became known as Cochran's Convent.
Dearest Mother and Dad, as per usual, I greet the sunrise, which is always glorious, although the wolves are rampant here. In uniform, a gal is plenty safe, due, I suppose, to the fundamental male dislike of women in uniform. We had a real sandstorm yesterday with Texas topsoil swirling and drifting over the walls. I wake up every morning with Texas between my teeth. I had my first hour of instrument in the AT-6. A dream ship, if ever there was one. I have never heard anything so inspiring as those 650 horses. A cockpit check involves 29 duties, and to remember them all is terrifically hard and confusing. 3 more girls washed out last week. It's getting rougher here.
1 in 3 women didn't make it, washing out of the program. It was a number consistent with male cadets.
The demerits didn't scare me as much as washing out, because that was the worst thing that could happen to you. And before evening, you were gone. Your bedroll was all rolled up. Your clothes were all gone. No note, no nothing.
Those who made it through the 6 months of training received their silver wings from Jackie Cochran, who flew in from her headquarters at the Pentagon.
Graduates now, they're members of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, fearless as falcons and twice as fast. And in their new and unusual occupation, these modern girls are still the feminine heirs to a noble tradition of pioneering strength and courage. Off they go to be conveyed to other ferry stations or to factories in the continental United States in order that they may deliver new fighter and trainer planes to masculine fighting hands. Stronger hands, perhaps, but no more valiant than those of their sisters, the Wasps.
We did the same thing that any other ferry command guy would have done. There's no other place in the military that you flew the variety of airplanes that you did in the ferry command. If you went into a fighter unit or into any other unit in the Army Air Corps, you stuck with that kind of an airplane. But in the ferry command, you had to fly whatever was out there and had to be moved, so we did get a terrific variety.
I don't have the exact statistics, but it is said that there was not a single type of airplane that was deployed in World War II that some woman didn't fly.
Women were assigned to air bases throughout the country. When 25 WASP arrived at Camp Davis in North Carolina, they found 50,000 men on base. Fresh from the confines of Cochran's Convent, the women dubbed it Wolf Swamp.
And Jacqueline Cochran, in all her wisdom, said, girls, I think that maybe you should not date too much until you get to know people. So in the telephone in the hallway of our barracks, I remember there was a list. Date him, don't date him. And if you came back from a date where you didn't think that this was an appropriate person that you would like your friends to date, his name got on the list.
I was at the officers club, but I wasn't in uniform. And they were having a party there, and these P-47 pilots, they were going overseas. So I was dancing with this guy, and he was telling me about, oh, this aircraft and blah, blah, and, you know, can't we get together, you know, and the old story, hey, I'm going away to war kind of thing. And I says, well, what kind of an airplane is it? And he went on to regale me with his big engine and, you know, what could happen on if it quits on takeoff and all this stuff. So the next morning, go into operations. I'm in my flight suit, and I'm writing up the manifest. And that guy did a double take. I thought he was going to drop dead. After all these stories that he told me about this P-47, he didn't, no idea that I was a P-47 pilot.
We have no hopes of replacing men pilots. But we can each release a man to combat, to overseas work. Delivering a trainer to Texas may be as important as delivering a bomber to Africa, if you take the long view. Cornelia Fort.
By mid-1943, WASPs were ferrying aircraft throughout the United States, often under difficult conditions. They flew 7 days a week and had to be ready for anything. Teresa James left one morning on a ferry trip that was to take a day. 17,000 miles, 6 airplanes, and 30 days later, she returned to base.
So I had a tan shirt and my gray slacks on, and that was it.
We never knew on a trip whether we were going to be in a single-engine airplane or a twin-engine airplane, or whether we were going to have room to carry stuff or not.
There was no such thing as wash and wear. It was just a plain shirt that I washed out and hung up at night, and it was just wrinkles. It had no resemblance to a shirt.
But we managed. You know, you can wear a pair of pants a long time.
You should have seen my slacks. My knees bulged. You could actually put cantaloupes in them. I met B.J. Erickson, and I asked, does she have an extra pair of slacks? She says, no. She says, God, James, you look like the wrath of God.
And we finally figured out that most of the airplanes had compartments in the wings where they put the bullets, and they were empty, so we could put a high-heel shoe out there in each one of them.
Finally got back to the base. I was gone 30 days. And I said, never again will I ever try anything. Just a short trip out and back.
The attitude that most non-flyers have about pilots is distressing and often acutely embarrassing. They chatter about the glamour of flying. Well, any pilot can tell you how glamorous it is. We get up in the cold dark in order to get to the airport by daylight. We wear heavy, cumbersome flying clothes and a 30-pound parachute. You're either hot or cold. You look forward all afternoon to the bath you will have and the steak. Sometimes we are too tired to eat and fall wearily into bed. Cornelia Fort.
As the WASP proved successful, their assignments expanded beyond ferrying into more dangerous areas. They became test pilots, flight instructors, and were even assigned to tow targets for artillery training using live ammunition.
We would fly up and down the beach, and they would either track us or shoot at us or whatever the mission called for. The gunfire never hit the fuselage to my knowledge. I may have gotten my first few gray hairs there, but I was not aware that I got shot.
Ann Baumgartner was sent to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where the Air Force tested airplanes, equipment, even pilots to their limit.
We're approaching the speed of sound, and this was one of the tasks that they were working on, trying to get airplanes faster, would go higher, go farther for the war effort. We also went in the pressure chamber. They can take you up to 25,000 feet, and we were shown how we thought we were in grand shape at 25,000 feet, but we couldn't even spell our own names when asked. That was to show us how dangerous it was to not use oxygen over 10,000 feet. But it was a fascinating place, and fascinating things were going on there. Wonderful planes were taking off that we had known about, that we didn't know about.
Baumgartner requested a transfer to the flight test program and became the only female test pilot at Wright Field, flying alongside the Air Force's finest. In 1943, she became the only woman to pilot the Bell YP-59A, the first jet fighter.
Just on takeoff, you could hear the big roar as you were going down the runway. And then as you were airborne, there was no noise at all. I thought the engines had quit, but it was just the noises behind you. That plane had taken the first step in jet flight, so it was a famous airplane.
The B-29 was the largest long-range bomber ever built. Rushed through production, it was critical to America's war with Japan. After Boeing's top pilot was killed testing it, the plane acquired a dangerous reputation. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the Enola Gay, was responsible for convincing pilots the B-29 was safe to fly. He would use the Wasp to make his point.
And that's where I thought, if I could train those two girls to fly, nobody had to say anything. Put those guys in the airplane with them and let them do the routine that I taught them to do.
I really didn't think that I was big enough to fly a 4-engine airplane. I'd never been in one before in my life. In those days, I was 5'5". I didn't think I had a 4-engine hand.
Dusenberry was to be flight engineer. He got me off to one side when he could. He said, "What are those?" I said, "Those are two women we're going to teach to fly the airplane." And he looked at me and said, "You're going to be in the airplane, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, Deuce, I'll be there." And I worked the girls hard 3 days. We flew for 7 hours a day.
And we went up and did the air work, you know, engine out procedures and stalls. And on final approach for our first landing, there was smoke coming out of number 3 engine.
We had a real problem with engine number 3 when the cockpit filled full of smoke. And Doris didn't take any instructions. She didn't hesitate 1 minute. Now, I'm sitting back beside the engineer. I'm back out of the way. I never opened my mouth. My engineer looked at me, you know, I told him, I said, "Deuce, wait."
I turned to look, and Dusenberry was our flight engineer. And sure enough, and so I told him to feather number 3 and pull the fire extinguisher, which he did.
There's no way I would have interfered. He did everything just like the book said to do it. When I thought they were ready, I said, "Okay, we're going to go." My orders were to go to Clovis, New Mexico, where this transition school was.
And then we were supposed to take them up with us and show them how to fly the B-29. Well, this was interesting position because these were seasoned four-engine combat crews.
They were dumbfounded that two women would fly that airplane that way when they said it wouldn't fly. It was an amazing effect. When they went through that routine that Dora and Dee Dee gave them, one of the men on that airplane came back, went into the operations officer, pulled off his wings. Now, these are all college football heroes, see? He pulled off his wings and threw them down on the desk of the operations officer. He said, "I'm finished. That's the end of it." This guy looked at him and said, "Lieutenant, pick up your wings. You're not finished, so we tell you you're finished."
This, of course, happened in late 1944. I never thought anything more about it. And then in 1995, I received a letter that really amazed me. I couldn't believe it. The man who wrote it said, "I realize that it was a long time ago, but I still want to thank you for helping me that day at Clovis. You came to show us that the B-29 plane was not one to be feared. You were the pilot that day and demonstrated your excellent flying skills and convinced us the B-29 was a plane that any pilot would be proud to fly." From that day on, we never had a pilot who didn't want to fly the B-29.
Because there were and are so many disbelievers in women pilots, especially in their place in the Army, all of us realized what a spot we were on. We had to deliver the goods or else there wouldn't ever be another chance for women pilots in any part of the service. Cornelia Fort.
WASPs were not always welcomed at bases where they were assigned. At Camp Davis, it was clear they were not wanted. Many planes assigned to WASPs were returned from combat and in need of repair. Women pilots experienced repeated engine failures. They expressed concern that the planes were not being properly maintained.
After a pilot flies a plane, if there's something wrong, they write it down. And it's supposed to be taken off the flight line until that's fixed. Well, what they would do was not ground the plane. They'd just write what the problem was, and off it would go.
After 2 WASPs died and another was seriously injured within 1 month, some women began to suspect foul play. Jackie Cochran came to investigate. She would later admit finding sugar in the gas tank of one of the downed planes. To her, it was a clear indication of sabotage. But concerned that adverse publicity could jeopardize her program, she kept it quiet. There would be no official investigation of the deaths at Camp Davis.
Mabel Rawlinson's death at Camp Davis, I don't know exactly what it could be attributed to. I did not go out to the crash scene, but the fire was intense. They could not get Mabel out, and she burned. It was a very traumatic time for all of us there. I remember there was an old nurse who came over to our barracks, and she had a couple of bottles of beer, and she sat on the end of the barracks out there watching the fire, drinking her beer and singing old hymns. "Nearer, my God, to thee, shall we gather at the river," and in a deep sort of whiskey tenor, and just thinking the thoughts that we all thought. Now, I think when you join the military, you obviously go through a mindset that you're prepared for something like this. This was the first time that I had seen a friend die, so it was a trauma for me, and I think for all of us.
I die violently, who can say it was before my time? I want no one to grieve for me. I was happiest in the sky, at dawn when the quietness of the air was like a caress, when the noon sun beat down, and at dusk when the sky was drenched with the fading light. Think of me there, and remember me, I hope, as I shall you. With love, Cornelia.
Cornelia Fort was killed on March 21st, 1943, when a male pilot accidentally clipped her wing in midair. She had been the first woman pilot in United States history to die for her country. The families of the WASPs who died received no benefits, no flag, and no gold star to hang in their windows. The government made no provision for returning the bodies back home because the women had no official military status. The WASP themselves would contribute money when necessary to send a body home for burial. Jackie Cochran was determined to gain official military recognition for the WASP, but she wanted it on her own terms. Hap Arnold suggested the WASP militarize under the Women's Army Corps, the WACs. But only one female colonel was allowed in the Army, and that position was taken by Ovita Culp Hobby.
So if Cochran was to become part of the WAC program, she would have to be subordinate to Ovita Culp Hobby, who was the director of the WAC. She was immensely talented and capable, and Jackie Cochran hated her.
Nearly 100,000 WACs served in the Army as nurses, clerks, and drivers, but none as pilots. Convinced WASPs would be grounded if they joined the WACs, Jackie Cochran refused. And referring to Hobby, she said, "I will not serve under a woman who doesn't know her ass from a propeller." Once again, Cochran appealed to her ally, Hap Arnold. Arnold agreed to go before Congress and proposed that the WASP be militarized under her command. But the timing couldn't have been worse. By early 1944, air superiority had been achieved in Europe, and American pilots began to return home. Pilot training programs in the U.S. were shut down, and civilian instructors now faced the draft, not as flyers, but as foot soldiers. But if the men could take over flying jobs held by the women, they would avoid the draft. They launched a campaign against the WASP in the press and in Congress. Powerful columnists of the day attacked Hap Arnold, Jackie Cochran, and the WASP program. Public sentiment began to change.
There's resistance because the American public in general believed that women served a useful, noble, patriotic purpose during the war, but they couldn't envision the need after the war.
Just 6 months earlier, it had been heroic to do a man's job, but by mid-1944 it was considered unpatriotic.
Everybody was anticipating peacetime and the return to normal. People wanted to go back to an America of work, of family, of friends, of home. It didn't include Mom going off to fly military planes.
Congressional hearings focused on the alleged high cost of training women pilots. Despite Hap Arnold's personal testimony and support from the War Department, the bid for WASP militarization failed. Congress recommended that all pilot training for women be stopped. They also recommended that women pilots already in service continue to fly, but without military status. But for Jackie Cochran, there could be no compromise. She compiled an exhaustive report detailing the WASP's accomplishments and released it to the press. The report revealed that the WASP had flown over 60 million miles in every type of aircraft, and that their safety and performance records were comparable to male pilots. Cochran gave Hap Arnold an ultimatum: find a way to militarize the program, including pilot training under her command, or shut it down. Arnold could no longer fight Cochran's battle. He had a war to win. In October 1944, he announced the WASP would be deactivated on December 20th. In a moving speech to the final graduating class, General Arnold acknowledged the WASP had exceeded all expectations, even his own.
Frankly, I didn't know in 1941 whether a slip of a girl could fight the controls of a B-17 in heavy weather. Those of us who had been flying for 20 or 30 years knew that flying an airplane was something that you do not learn overnight. But Miss Cochran said that carefully selected young women could be trained to fly our combat-type planes. So it was only right that we took advantage of every skill that we as a nation possess. We can come to only one conclusion: the entire operation has been a tremendous success. It is on the record that women can fly as well as men in training, in safety, and in operation.
When we were getting ready to be disbanded, we volunteered to do this for nothing. I'd have flown those airplanes for free.
And it was such a shock to it. It was, when we know that we were needed, when we were doing most of the flying of the pursuit aircraft, you know, it was sort of silly.
When we were disbanded, the war was still on, of course. I went back to school. I had to finish my junior year at Northwestern. And I felt very strange because I was older than most of the students. I went, they had a veterans group there, and I went to join that, and they said, "You're not a veteran, you're not allowed in here."
When I was disbanded on the 20th of December, there were 60-some P-51s and P-38s sitting on the field undelivered that day. And yet all my girls got in cars and drove home. And that was very, very sad because we were badly needed.
No time to waste. Everywhere they're badly needed for ferrying duty so that the men trained and training can go off to fight while WASPs help get their ships started on the road overseas. There is a reason for the WASPs. So long, ladies. Go to it. Someday you'll be able to sit down in the evening with your husbands, who will probably be flyers, and remind them that during the war, you did your part. Keep them flying, Pivanella.
Jackie had a dream, just like the rest of us. And it took me years to understand that. She really wanted us all to be able to fly everything, just to show the men that it could be done. And I think she largely succeeded in this.
She fought for us. She fought for the concept that she believed in, that women could do this. She probably was the only person that could have done it as effectively.
It wouldn't have existed without her. Cochran is a complicated figure. She may have had the temperament of black and white, but her own life viewed from the perspective of history, is one of many shades of gray. It's very difficult to understand those contradictions, but it's what makes her fascinating as an individual.
Jackie Cochran remained at the Pentagon as a special consultant to Hap Arnold and was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for her wartime service. In 1948, she finally received her military commission as Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force Reserves. Continuing to establish new speed records, she became the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953.
It was incredibly beautiful to be able to do what we knew we wanted to do, and we were very patriotic about it all.
It was not what they did for themselves, but how they fit in and did a job for the war effort.
And I think that what the WASP did was to reaffirm the fact that we are still the pioneer women that my grandmother represented, that we are still capable of firing the musket.
My grandfather always said that no matter what you do inside that mighty machine, from the smallest cog up, you make it run, and they help make it run. They help win that war. In the larger context, they create the legend, the precedent of what women can do. No one is ever able to say a woman cannot do a flying job or a technical job. They help make that true.
The WASP in World War II accomplished a necessary mission. Now, they could have been sent to the war had the law allowed it, and they would probably have done as good as the men had they had equal experience.
These thoughts are something that we should contemplate when we think what the WASP did and what other women in the military have done and should do, because half of the brain power of our country is in the heads of its women. And if we don't use this to the best of our advantage, then we are the poorer for it.
I, for one, am profoundly grateful that my one talent, my only knowledge, flying, happens to be of use to my country when it is needed. That's all the luck I ever hope to have.
Follow a WASP across the country. Get a close-up look at a B-29. And check out Wayback, the new online magazine for kids. The American Experience Online. www.pbs.org. To order Fly Girls on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS.
Keep the wings level and true. If you live to be a gray-haired wonder, keep the nose
production of WGBH, Boston. Major funding for the American Experience is provided by the annual financial support of PBS viewers like you, and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also supports the Sloan Technology Series, a collection of books chronicling the major technologies of the 20th century.
Each American experience is made possible by Liberty. Liberty Mutual Insurance.
And by Scott's Lawn Care Products. With Scott's Turf Builder, anyone can turn their own little piece of America into a place to be cherished, season after season after season.
This is History's Best on PBS.
A violent past ripped this land apart, creating thousands of islands that became the paradise, wild Indonesia. Here life grabbed its chance to bloom and gave birth to some of the strangest creatures on Earth. Come explore the dazzling diversity of wild Indonesia. Premieres May 26th on PBS.
Broadcast of the American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Sovereignet, with offices in Bellows Falls and Burlington, providing locally owned and operated statewide internet access and made-to-order high-speed business solutions to Vermont and New Hampshire. By the 55 attorneys at Downs, Racklin, and Martin, providing sophisticated legal services to businesses and institutions throughout the North Country, from offices in Burlington, St. Johnsbury, and Brattleboro, Vermont, and Littleton, New Hampshire. By Schumacher Design of Montreal, Quebec, creators of the new Vermont Public Television logo, offering logos, brochures, posters, and much more. Schumacher Design, image makers for business and the arts. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you.
You're watching viewer-supported Vermont Public Television, Vermont's statewide public television network.
For many years, you've heard us say that members are the strength of Vermont Public Television, and that your donation directly supports the program you rely on. And while you may consider your individual donation to be just a drop in the bucket, the truth is that all of those drops together add up to a very important 64% of our operating budget. June 30th marks the end of our fiscal year, and we still have a substantial amount to raise in order to balance our budget. If you're currently a member of Vermont Public Television, you may have already received a mailing asking for additional support. We hope you can respond. If you're not a member, now is a crucial time to show your support for public television and let your donation be counted. Together, those individual drops will ensure the continued quality programming that you expect from Vermont Public Television. We'll say it again, members are our strength, and your individual donation has never been more important. We hope you can help.
Broadcast of the American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by Sovereignet, with offices in Bellows Falls and Burlington, providing locally owned and operated statewide internet access and made-to-order high-speed business solutions to Vermont and New Hampshire. By the 55 attorneys at Downs, Racklin, and Martin, providing sophisticated legal services to businesses and institutions throughout the North Country, from offices in Burlington, St. Johnsbury, and Brattleboro, Vermont, and Littleton, New Hampshire. By Schumacher Design of Montreal, Quebec, creators of the new Vermont Public Television logo, offering logos, brochures, posters, and much more. Schumacher Design, image makers for business and the arts. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you.
presenting history's best on PBS. They called her Lady Lindy. Amelia Earhart set out on a flight no one had ever attempted.
There was a lack of focus. She simply was not preparing properly for it.
It's hard work being Amelia Earhart, and she was being pushed and pushed and pushed. I don't think she was eager to take that flight.
Amelia Earhart, tonight on The American Experience. Major funding for the American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology in American society, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the annual financial support of viewers like you.
And by Miracle Grow plant food. For flowers, for vegetables, whatever you grow, a gardener's true friend is Miracle Grow.
Each American experience is made possible by Liberty. Liberty Mutual Insurance.
Good evening and welcome to the American Experience. I'm David McCullough. From the day of her first flying lesson in 1921, Amelia Earhart knew her life would be incomplete until she had her own plane. The die was cast. In a handful of years, she became the best-known woman pilot in America. She was daring and determined, outspoken about women breaking the conventional bonds. But she was also very photogenic. It was the daring and the glamour in combination that made her an irresistible symbol of new womanhood. Popular interest in her was enormous, phenomenal for a woman then, and this even before her mysterious death. Tonight's film, I must tell you at the start, is not about the theories concerning her death, some of which are highly bizarre and based on pure conjecture. Our story is about her life. It's about pioneer aviation and plain exploitation, and the parts played by alcoholic men in her life, beginning with her father. Besides, there is her own puzzling disregard for such obvious professional necessities as knowing the Morse code or how to operate a radio, and the fact that the Queen of the Air was not the best of pilots. Relentlessly manipulated as a hot property, she became a captive of celebrity at the very time that the press and the movies were so dramatically inflating the importance of celebrity. By the time of her final flight, she was trapped. Always hard to know, she became increasingly remote. The real mystery at the end is not in her death, but in herself.
On a summer day in 1932, Amelia Earhart completed another record-breaking flight. A few weeks earlier, she had made history by being the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. Now she was a superstar, and her every move fascinated the public.
Yesterday, I hopped off from Los Angeles about noontime and landed in Newark this morning after a non-stop transcontinental trip.
And what did you carry on the trip?
You mean to eat?
Yeah, to eat and drink.
Well, I carried some water, of course, because my cockpit is very warm. And I carried a sandwich in case. I didn't eat it, though. I carried some hot chocolate and the old reliable tomato juice.
What kind of a sandwich was it?
Chicken sandwich.
I have walked the streets with many famous people in my time, from Greta Garbo to Paul Newman to Eleanor Roosevelt. No one got the crowd that Amelia got. She was, I must say, it was beyond stardom. It was a strange continuum that she and Lindbergh occupied. They were like gods from outer space. And people would just stand and stare at her.
Amelia Earhart was a legend, the first modern American heroine, adored because she was daring and successful in a man's world, and because she was magnificently promoted in the press and newsreels of the time. Yet Amelia Earhart, the best-known woman in America, would always remain curiously remote. "I don't know you at all," her closest friend wrote. "I doubt anyone does."
The one thing that she really feared in life was that nothing would happen. She had to have an important life, and that meant you had to have adventure. You had to try things that were exciting. In that, all of her life, there's no